Well, I wanted to go back to what I gave you a sneak peek on yesterday, which is what the farmers across the country are telling us about cover crops. It's been really interesting as we started to look at this data just in the last week to see some of this information. And I want to credit my co-authors on this particular presentation, Karen Scanlon from the Conservation Technology Information Center, and Chad Watts also from CTIC, and I particularly want to thank Chad for a lot of the graphs you're going to see, and also Alan Weber. The team of the four of us has worked on this, both design and evaluation of the survey information, but we've had some other help as well. The Midwest Cover Crops Council Steering Committee gave us a big hand in designing the first year of the survey, and also Dr. Linda Propicki at Purdue University this past year. So you saw just a bit of data yesterday on the yield. We're going to take a closer look at that today. We're going to take just a short look at some of the data from a year ago to set the stage for this new information, but I want to spend about 80% of my time with this new survey information, a survey that's still ongoing, but for which we already have over 1,500 responses. So the new survey, again, 1,500 responses of farmers using cover crops. They represent over 300,000 acres of actual cover crops planted this past year. We also added a component for farmers not yet using cover crops. Basically, when they go to the survey, the first question they see is, are you using cover crops or not? And in the wonders of SurveyMonkey, you either go into a set of questions for non-users or a set for the people who have used cover crops. So those would be the two things we'll be reporting on, both the year ago survey and the new one. This figure is similar to one you saw yesterday on total acreage from the 2013 survey. This is actually a year ago, but I thought it was kind of interesting to see where we're at in terms of actual acreage on farms. So in this case, if you look back to 2008, you'd see a little over 100 acres used on farms, jumping to over 300 in 2012, which was the crop year surveyed, with farmers projecting to continue on up to over 400. So, you know, that just kind of tells me this is not something where people are putting it out on the back 40, but it's becoming a significant practice for many farms. And we indeed have farmers here in the audience who are using 1,000, 2,000 or more acres of cover crops. We talked briefly about the yield impact yesterday, and I'm going to show you a couple of the same slides, but then go into some more detail. So, you know, the big question with cover crops, I think up until last year was, you know, they're growing out there in the spring. Surely if it's a dry year, they're going to take moisture away from our corn and soybeans or other cash crops, right? They're transpiring water, so that's got to be a bad thing in a dry year. I think for people who did not have experience with cover crops, there was a widespread sentiment that was the case. And I showed you this slide yesterday that, in fact, the opposite happened, that we had, as those blue bars show, the blue bars are with cover crops, the red bars are without. This is corn on the left and soybeans on the right. We had a yield increase of about 11 bushels on corn in the drought year of 2012. Now this is over 200 farmers that had what they felt like were the same soil type with similar varieties, similar planting dates. Similar situation for soybeans, about a 5-bushel yield increase. So why is that happening? A cover crop is out there transpiring moisture, so surely it's taking the moisture away from the cash crop. Well, we thought, well, maybe there's something else going on. So let's look at the states that are the hardest hit by drought in 2012. And this is based on the Nebraska Drought Index. Many of you have seen those maps. So we looked at 7 states in particular where we had a fair number of respondents. There were certainly states farther west that were also hit hard by drought, but these were ones where we had a fair number of respondents. And this is what we saw when we zeroed in. So we went from a 9.6% increase for corn for all respondents to an 11% yield increase following cover crops in those harder hit drought states. And when we looked at the soybeans, it was even a little bit bigger magnitude, from 11.6 to a 14% increase for soybeans in those harder hit drought states. So clearly something was happening, and we were hearing this anecdotally. You heard a couple farmers talk about this yesterday, where those cover crops were really helping the corn and soybeans in that drought year. So let's take a look at about what might be going on. Again, this was something that was a surprise to a lot of people. I think we were surprised when we looked at the data. I'm not going to take time to show you, but we broke the data into farmers that had used cover crops for a year or two and those that had used them 3 years or more. And even the ones that had just used them for a year or two were seeing benefits. for their yield. And I think this has to do with a few things. We're hearing that there's deeper rooting following certain cash crops, maybe not all of them, but things like annual ryegrass, the oilseed radishes, possibly cereal rye and others, that if we can get that corn, instead of rooting 30 inches deep, to root 3.5 or maybe even 4 feet deep, we're going to get more moisture, obviously, out of that soil profile. And in a dry year like 2012, obviously that really helps as that moisture profile is retreating in the soil root zone. Secondly, for some cover crops, we're going to have a residue blanket out there. You saw pictures yesterday of rye being rolled or otherwise knocked down by a planter, creating a residue blanket. We're going to have that with certain other cover crops, and obviously that can help reduce evaporation from those fields. And then we get back to the soil health aspects. We've got some great soil health people here who've talked to you some yesterday about what happens when we can get more mycorrhizae associating with the roots and other beneficial changes in our soil biology, that's going to increase our rooting surface area so that we can take up more water and more nutrients, both of which are going to help in the drought. So those are all things that can possibly happen right away depending on the cover crops used and the cropping system. And it seems to help explain some of what's going on in the short term. But we know there's also long-term benefits, and you heard some farmers talking very eloquently about these yesterday, especially the increased organic matter. We know from people like Gabe Brown and the colleagues he works with in North Dakota that you can really change the rainfall infiltration and keep all of that rainfall in the field rather than letting some of it run off and escape. Getting better retention of this moisture in the soil profile so that the water is not draining out in the more free-draining soils and keeping it in the root zone. Better soil health again, less restrictions on root growth. If we've got a hard pan or clay pan or fragipan, if we can use cover crops to help create root channels and earthworm activity and other things that are going to increase the depth of rooting of our cash crops, that's going to help over time. And another thing that we sometimes overlook, and I've heard many of these farmers here talk about this, is it's not just adding cover crops, but usually there's additional changes in management that are going on. They're moving from conventional till to no-till, or they're making other changes, maybe integrating livestock more into the operation. And those changes, too, are helping with that moisture management. So all of that, I think, is contributing to this picture where we're seeing cover crops in many cases, not every single farm, but in many cases helping in a dry situation. So the question we had then is, what's going to happen in a different weather year? When we said we were going to repeat the survey, we really didn't know what would happen in 2013, but obviously for many parts of the Corn Belt, we had a wet spring, and although it got dry later in the summer, overall a pretty good crop year. So let's look more at this data. Again, this is a slide I showed you yesterday where we had an 8-bushel increase in corn following cover crops. So the blue bars was the after cover crops, red bars without, an 8-bushel increase in corn. That's just under 5% and just under a 5% increase in soybeans. And this is again based on a large number of farmers. Over 500 farmers reported this information from many different states. Let's take a look at some of these different states. These are not all the states we surveyed by any means, but some of the Corn Belt states where we had a lot of responses, about a dozen of them. And you can see the pattern is pretty consistent, that in no states was there a situation where the cover crops caused a lower yield of the cash crop. We had a couple like Iowa and Missouri where there wasn't much of a difference really between the cover crops and no cover crops, but in others there was a strong difference. And certainly you go into those states and look at the individual numbers. Some farmers had a very positive response, some maybe had a slight reduction, others were equal. But the overall pattern is pretty consistent, and we saw this last year as well, that we looked across all these states, and with the slight exception of Minnesota where we only had a couple respondents, every state had a positive pattern to the cover crop response. So that tells me that this impact is real and it's happening in a lot of different places. So I think, again, I showed this slide yesterday, based on 2 years of survey data with several hundred farmers, that we can say that for those 2 years at least, that we had a 5 to 10% yield increase following cover crops as an overall average. And that is very significant because a year and a half ago, we did not know that. We had small-scale plot work, and we had some anecdotal farmer work, but we did really not know what the large-scale impact of cover crops on yield was. And this has had an impact. It had an impact on some changes to the crop insurance policy this past spring, especially because of the drought information. And the question is, as we go forward, what are we going to continue to find about these yield impacts going forward? The one thing I would say, I explained some of the issues with the drought, but this year with a more normal year, why are we seeing that 5% yield benefit? I saw a talk just last week by Dr. Matt Liebman from Iowa State University. Many of you know him. He's a well-known professor there that's done a lot of work on cropping systems. He's had a 10-year-long study looking at different crop rotation systems, conventional corn and soybeans, adding a third and even a fourth crop into that rotation. And he's documented what many other agronomists have seen over the years, that when you add a crop into a rotation that's just had one or two crops, you're going to see often a 5% yield benefit. That's the exact yield benefit they saw over that 10-year study, is a 5% yield benefit. So I think some of this is our normal rotation benefit when we get more biodiversity into that system and the benefits that provides for soil health. So for me as an agronomist, that 5% number is very believable, but more importantly, it's borne out by over 500 farmers reporting that information. Now, where are these respondents coming from? This is just a visual depiction. The blue and purple bars are states are the ones with the most respondents, but even the red had a fair number, at least 23 or so. You can see pretty scattered out across the country, and even the yellow states all had at least some respondents. I want to show you some other data besides the yield, though, because there was a lot else coming out of the survey, and I've only got time to show you about half of the data. We'll be finishing up the analysis of this over the next couple months. But first of all, it's not a big surprise that the number one thing being used is the winter cereal grains. And of course, the big one there is cereal rye, but also winter wheat and triticale. We still see a strong use of legumes across the country. That's going to be everything from the various clover species to the vetch, Austrian winter peas, and so on. Brassicas clearly have come on quite strongly over the last several years, led by the oilseed radishes, but also turnips and other brassicas that are out there. And I think we're going to see even more use of those, especially in the blends. And then the annual grasses, the annual ryegrass, oats, millets, and so on. One thing we saw last year is that the more experienced farmers had with cover crops, the more they moved to multi-way blends of cover crops. And I think that's a pattern we'll probably see continue. What about the tillage system? What are the people using that are using cover crops? This is based on over 1,500 farmers using cover crops. What are they using for tillage? You can see continuous no-till is a big one at over 40%, but also quite a few are doing conventional tillage still. And some other approaches, some that are doing rotational no-till, where after their soybeans, they're no-tilling that corn into the soybean residue without any tillage at that step of the operation. So clearly a variety of approaches out there. What about when we talk about the preliminary method of seeding the cover crop? This was interesting to me because my perception was that a lot of people were flying it on and other things. I was a little bit surprised to find that the biggest use was still drilling. And maybe that reflects the fact that that's the most reliable way to go based on the equipment that we have available today. There is a fair number of people that are broadcast seeding with light incorporation. That's the light blue here. The aerial seeding is at about 14% nationally. This one is interesting to me, the precision seeding with the corn and soybean planter. Dave Brandt's probably the most well-known person that's made great progress with that, but I suspect we'll see that number continuing to grow, especially if we can figure out how to get earlier maturing corn and soybean varieties so that we can get in there with that precision planting. And then just other types of broadcast seeding are at 12%. So again, a variety of approaches. We asked the farmers who are not yet using cover crops, what's holding you back? You know, what's your concerns about cover crops? There are a wide range of responses here. One thing to note is that out of the 500 plus responses, there wasn't any one thing that a majority of them said was a problem. So even these things that we've highlighted in red, like the perception that cover crops can make planting their cash crop more difficult, that's the top bar, that was still less than half of them. But that was one of the things that stood out. Also, the perception that cover crops are costly, that's the second bar you see there. And then third, the availability of planting equipment or having service providers that can do it. So those were kind of the three that maybe stood out the most. But again, a variety of reasons for the farmers surveyed not yet using cover crops. So we kind of turned that around and said for ag retailers, you know, what are the role that they need to be playing? These are the companies that are, of course, selling fertilizer, selling herbicides, providing pesticide treatments, fungicides, and so on. What can they be doing in this space as people who have agronomists that are out there in most counties working directly with farmers? We asked both the users of cover crops and the non-users. So the non-users are the blue bars, and the farmers already using cover crops are the green bars. And what we found is that they had pretty similar responses. The very first one I thought was interesting. That top bar is helping assess and understand soil changes resulting from cover crop use. And we found that both of them thought that was pretty important, especially the ones already using cover crops. So some of you heard Rick Haney talk about yesterday his new soil health testing protocol that's being offered at a number of labs. That's the sort of thing I think we're going to see more co-ops and ag retailers providing, is not just NP and K testing, but what is really changing with the soil health characteristics out there. The farmers are asking for that, even the ones not yet using cover crops. So I see that as a very positive thing. But there are still the nutrient management issues. If you've got these cover crops, how do you need to adjust your fertility practices to take into account what the cover crops are doing for you? Providing advice on how to terminate them, and of course providing that service if it's a herbicide application. Providing cover crop seeding services, that's the fourth one down. Not quite as high, but still a pretty significant fraction of the farmers are interested in that. So as I look at how do we get to 20 million acres, you know, more farmers are going to figure out how to do this on their own, clearly. But for the large number of farmers, I think we're going to have other people helping with that service, whether it's aerial application, high clearance seeders, whatever it may be. But clearly the ag retailers with their high clearance equipment that's otherwise sitting pretty idle in August, in a lot of cases, early September, and maybe an underutilized group of staff that they can be working with, have the capability of going out and providing that seeding service in August and early September. The one thing they were not as excited about is having the ag retailers encourage them to plant cover crops. Now the guys that are already using it said, yeah, that's a good idea, but the ones that are not yet, they don't want to be told what to do. That's not a surprise. Who likes to be told what to do, right? All right, what about the median cost? I kind of mentioned this yesterday, but the median national cost that people are paying for seed is $25. That's probably not a surprise. The establishment costs they're paying on a median basis, if they're hiring it done, is $12 an acre. What they said they were willing to pay was $10 an acre. I guess that's like when we go buy a car, none of us want to pay as much as the car is being sold at, but interesting to just see those figures. All right, what is the primary termination method that people are using? This was interesting to see too. So herbicide is the big dominant one, but whoops, go back. The herbicide one is at about just under half of the users. Roller crimper, still only about 1%, but clearly for organic farmers, that's a really big, important one to have. I was surprised to see how many are still using tillage to control their cover crop. I would think that's something we'll see continue to decline. But that's one that's still out there. A fair number are mowing at 10%, and then about just under 20%, the purple slice of the pie, are using cover crops that winter kill. So they're letting nature do the work of taking care of that cover crop for them. This is a really interesting one. I would submit that there's been the perception that a lot of people are using cover crops, and this is coming from those less familiar with them, are only doing it because the government is paying them to do it. Well, look at this information. The big purple slice here at 63%. No, I have not received financial assistance to plant cover crops. Not received assistance to plant financial cover crops. So to me, this explodes the myth that people are only planting cover crops because the government is paying them to do it. When 63% of the farmers out of this national survey, this is over 1,500 farmers, are saying they have not received any financial assistance to plant them. And look at the other end, only 8%, this little tiny slice, are saying I only plant cover crops basically when I've had cost-share assistance. There is 14% that say, yeah, I got some to start with, but now I'm self-funding it. And then another 15 are saying I've occasionally had some financial assistance. So this is not to diminish the role of financial assistance. Obviously it has helped. We would not be where we are today without the cost share programs at both the federal and state level. But I think it shows us that we can go forward and get higher adoption without having to have a 20-fold increase in financial incentives. That maybe, and we'll talk about this in the breakouts today, you know, how do we package these incentives to catalyze further adoption? Is it something you do for just a couple of years? How do you do it to make it work? So we want to hear what your ideas are on that. But again, I think this explodes the myth that people are only planting cover crops because they're getting paid to do it. Clearly the majority are not doing that. Okay, this is actually not a survey slide, but it's important to fit in with what we've been talking about on Costshare Assistance. I appreciated getting from Norm Widman with NRCS this data on what's going on with cover crop acreage as far as cost share or other technical assistance nationally. So there is a little over, as I understand the data, a little over 1 million acres of cover crops nationally that have received either cost share assistance or technical assistance. And we don't know the exact numbers, but maybe about 80% of that, it sounds like, was cost share. And these are the states that got either cost share or technical. And the main takeaway from this visual for me is that it's all over the country. It's not just the Corn Belt, but we have states in the southeast, the south, the west, maybe not as much the Pacific Northwest, but it's really all over where the NRCS has been active in this space with cover crops, which is great. That's what we want to see. Let's look at another type of cover crop incentive, and then I'll wrap up. So if we could use cover crops and that would result in a lower crop insurance premium, we talked about the benefit for drought. You know, would that lead you to plant more cover crops? And about 25% of the farmers, the brown top bar, about 25% of both the users and non-users said that would definitely lead them to plant more cover crops. So that's something to look at, perhaps. The vast majority of the yellow bars said they weren't quite sure how much that would increase adoption, that maybe it would, and then only about 15% said it probably wouldn't make a difference. So that's another thing to talk about during the breakouts today. And I want to just give the farmers the last word from this survey, and I thank Chad for helping pull out some of this information. So these are just a few farmer quotes that we pulled out. We gave them an open-ended, what would you tell your neighbor farmer about cover crops that's maybe not using them? And these are what a few of them had to say. It's a systems approach based on a return to the way nature is intended to work and therefore can be extremely successful. A systems approach. How often have you heard that said about soil health and cover crops? If you expect to be able to farm your land in 50 years or have your child or grandchild farm it, then you need to use cover crops. You need to think ahead for building that soil for the future. Another respondent, there's a wide array of cover crops that can improve every rotation in soil with a little bit of planning. And I think that's an important one for that thought, well, it works for this guy in that county or those people in Ohio, but it doesn't work for me here in Kansas or in Iowa. So we need to look at that thought that there's a variety of approaches that work. Keeping the soil covered year-round provides food for the life in the soil, which in turn provides nutrients for your crop. So we heard this yesterday. We're feeding the soil, which is feeding our cash crop. And then finally, the simple but true, we must take better care of the soil we depend on. So these farmers, they get it, and many of them are here and are sharing that message with us. But I think it was really interesting to see what's going on nationally. We'll have the full report on this out later this spring, probably May or so, and that'll be available on the SARE website. So thank you for your attention.